For my presentation, I chose Spencer Short's The Gentle Art of Shabby Dressing. It reads, "There's nothing dandier than threadbare threads worn by a discerning shabby dresser. A collar's fret or subtle fray is not lesser because it's worn away, but models instead the bespoke tailoring of time itself. Done poorly, the gentleman farmer's piecemeal pastoral that no-ho charmer's duct-tape boots. It's like an unread bookshelf of second-hand prose, a too-studied pose. Done well, it draws you in to draw you near, reveals the intricate pattern in the year's inexorable ravel between decompose and deconstruct. What seemed a foppish quirk grows wise, design undone, we wear time's work." The most notable thing that pops out at first is that the poem is a sonnet. It's a mix in terms of rhyme scheme of the Petrarchan and Shakespearean. It's ABBA all the way for the quatrains, and then it's got that couplet of GG just like a Shakespearean does. So it also follows the form of a Shakespearean sonnet. There's no set meter, which we typically have in a sonnet. But the use of the sonnet allows for a narrative arc that can be broken into clear, distinct parts. We have an introduction where the poet introduces his thesis, which is that shabby dressing is an art form. And then we have two complication quatrains that it can be done well and that it can be done poorly. And then we have the final couplet, which is the resolution, which proves what the speaker is saying. It shows his belief in his hypothesis. So all throughout the poem, we have a very clear use of metaphor. The central metaphor is that wearing shabby clothes is akin to wearing time's work, which is what the speaker quotes. He also says the bespoke tailoring of time itself, and what seems a foppish quirk grows wise. So the central idea of shabby dressing being like wearing time's design. There is a secondary metaphor throughout, especially in the second quatrain, where we are comparing piecemeal pastoral and duct tape boots to an unread bookshelf of secondhand prose in a too-studied pose. That is to say that they are bad. And then we go on to introduce in the third quatrain how they can be good, which supports the narrative arc given earlier. These things lead to the central idea, which is that shabby dressing can be done well, it can be poorly, so therefore it's something that takes practice to master. And if it takes practice, we can consider it a skill, and if it's a skill, it can be considered an art form, which is another way that the sonnet helps. It kind of introduces that in a play-by-play format. So if we break down the poem a little bit further, we see Bligh's powers of poetry all throughout. The whole thing is in spoken language, which is the foundation of any good poem. There's the sound element, which is in the rhyme scheme, as well as the narrative, but both of which are a part of the sonnet structure. We also have a strong use of imagery, a couple of quotes that support that. "A collar's fret or subtle fray is not lesser," and "piecemeal pastoral that no-ho charmer's duct tape boots." These are very obvious forms of imagery. It was necessary, I believe, for the poet to include imagery because of the subject matter. We are describing different pieces of clothing and the shabbiness of them, therefore it's kind of necessary to have that mental image. And imagery is a very important part of building the metaphor he uses for that time design that I've previously stated. It also helps with the psychic weight. So the imagery works to convince us of this meaning of the poem, which is the psychic weight, the central idea, which is that wearing old clothes shouldn't be considered bad, but rather an art form. And not only does the imagery kind of fit into that, but the metaphor also builds into the psychic weight. So it adds that not only is shabby dressing an art form, but that it's one that should be respected, and it's interesting, and it's exciting, and it's like wearing time's work, as the poet wrote. The lines used to support this have already mentioned the bespoke tailoring of time itself, and what seemed a foppish quirk grows wise. Of course, there's also the time element that plays into this, but that is very obviously for the addition of the psychic weight in the metaphor.